Okay, so here we go. It's Road Games with Miss Jamie Lee Curtis, and this one takes place in Australia.
Okay, I had only just recently watched this film. It's incredibly hard to find. My dad actually had a hard time trying to find it on the internet. Um, it's an Ozploitation film. It was shot in Australia. Actually, it was shot back to back with Terror Train, so it was kind of interesting for Jamie Lee Curtis to go from a very, very cold climate to a very, very dry and hot climate. But they were shot back to back. Um, this film probably not my favorite out of her Scream Queen years, just because this film actually isn't that violent. And she's actually not in it too much. Um, but let's start the review.
The opening sequence, we see a motel, and we're introduced to a truck driver who has a dingo as a companion, or quote unquote dingo. He's looking for a place to rest for the night, but a guy in a green van kinda takes the last room, and he kinda hooks up with a girl, which he was kinda debating on whether or not he should hook up with her. So in the end, he just chills out in the back of his truck. And the guy who took the last room and took the girl is a serial killer. And he's about to kill the lady that the truck driver wanted to hook up with. So the next day, he wakes up and decides, okay, better get started on the next run. The dingo obviously knows something wrong. He gets the inkling that something is wrong. Um, Many people have compared this to Rear Window, and actually the creators of the film have done so as well, because this is a guy who's a lone guy. Um, oh yeah, and there's Miss Curtis as we see her. Um, and he thinks he sees something going on, but he's not 100% sure what it is, because he doesn't actually see any violence. Um, Along the way, the truck driver experiences or encounters different unique people, keeps encountering Miss Curtis as a hitchhiker, and we see the supposed killer who doesn't look like someone who you would suspect to be a serial killer. The locals just want to mind their own business, which is evident when he tries to call for help. Um, Once again, encounters different characters on his road travels. And finally, we see Miss Jamie Lee Curtis. Um, as I said before, this was probably not her greatest Scream Queen film. Not because she did a bad performance, and not even so much that the movie is bad. She's just not in it that much. Mostly we're focused on the truck driver and the dingo. Once again, quote unquote dingo. Um, we see the cops questioning the truck driver, asking what's going on, what's he up to, because they suspect that maybe he has to do with the murders that have been going on, which he's heard over the radio. Once again, and Jamie Lee Curtis also suspects something's wrong. They try to hint at a little bit of a romance in this film, but it doesn't really go that far. Um, Once again, we see Jamie Lee Curtis. She goes on the initiative. She tries to check stuff out, and so we see her go into the van to try to check out the cooler, and it turns out he's there and he surprises her. So now we flash back to outside, and he doesn't see our Miss Curtis anymore, so he decides to make a break for us. Like Jimmy Stewart's character in Rear Window, he starts to go through this sort of doubt, hypnosis thing where he is convinced, okay, something must have happened, something didn't happen, there's a reasonable and logical explanation. In this case, he's thinking that the hitchhiker, Jamie Lee Curtis's character, he thinks that she ran off with the guy in the van and that they're having sex in the brush. Um, One interesting thing about this film that I actually kind of, yeah, there was food in that cooler. That was interesting about this film was that there was not a heck of a lot of gore. There was more or less a lot of implied stuff. This right here, it's implied that, okay, is this a pig? Or could it possibly be human because the weights at two different stops just don't match up? And once again, we see he's going through some sort of highway hypnosis. Once again, he sees the green van, and he's back to being convinced, okay, something is going on. I just don't understand what it is, and I'm going to follow him. Um, but yeah, a lot of stuff is implied in this particular quote unquote slasher film, despite the fact that most slasher films, even in the early 80s, showed some sort of slashing going on, and this film did not. I mean, it was a homage to a lot of the older thriller type films, not just Rear Window, but Hitchcock, even some of the older monster films. A lot of it is just implied stuff. Like we hear about, okay, there's a serial killer on the loose, but we don't see really anything, and he's now caught up with the killer, and now we know, okay, Buddy's not insane. Something was going on, and this is probably a very funny point in the story of the movie. Once again, playing homage to Hitchcock, a very serious moment actually turns into the "Oh, are you kidding me?" sort of moment. And then we find out that the dog really isn't a dingo. And, oh, Hitch is still alive. And she confirms that the guy who kidnapped her was the guy he was beating on. And that he's the real serial killer. And we flash, and he mentions how he thought that the meat was possibly her. And then we're flashing back to the butcher, and we're done the movie.
So, in conclusion, not a bad film. I am not the biggest fan just because Jamie Lee Curtis wasn't in it that much. Um, this is considered a slasher flick, despite the fact there's no real slashing going on. We maybe have one victim who we see die. Oh yeah, and we see a head go in the bucket. But we don't really see any of the violence. But I can see why a lot of people still consider it to be a slasher film. And the main reason is, well, to be quite frank, um, what you don't see is pretty scary. And we saw nothing in this film. We saw nothing. Even when Jamie Lee Curtis got captured, we saw nothing. We didn't see him capture her, we just saw his face, but nothing else. Like, we were completely in the dark as to what happened next. And for a good chunk of the film, you're wondering if she's still even alive. Um, Once again, going back to the theory that this was inspired by Rear Window. Well, in Rear Window, you don't see the murder take place. And despite the fact that it was only shot in one location, whereas this was shot in multiple locations, you had very few main characters. You had very little interaction with other characters, despite the fact that you saw them from a distance. And to be fair, in this film, you saw them from a distance as well. And you're convinced something is going on, but quite a few people think you're crazy. So, overall, this was not a bad film, not a bad horror movie, slasher flick. It just wasn't bad. I have most certainly seen worse. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking I'm doing a lot of good movie reviews. Rest assured, I will be doing a lot of bad movie reviews as well. So, to top it all off, it was a good movie. Not great, and it most certainly isn't my favorite. It was okay. So, thanks a lot for sticking around for these three reviews. I've got three more coming up on Halloween, and it's finishing off Jamie Lee Curtis for now because she has other horror movies I would like to review in the future. See you next week.